Thanks to all of you for joining us today for a panel discussion on intellectuals and the left, put on by the UC Santa Cruz chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm Jasper. I'm an undergraduate in my last quarter at UCSC studying psychology and a member of the UC Santa Cruz chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society, a student club dedicated to hosting the conversation on the left. In the past year, we have hosted coffee breaks outside Cowell Dining Hall, and we've hosted reading groups in the McHenry Library. We also host panels such as this one. Our most recent panel was on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its meaning for the left. Over the summer, we plan to host a reading group over Zoom using some of Karl Marx's writings. Feel free to talk to me after the panel if you'd like to get involved in our activities or want further information. So today, our panel is on intellectuals and the left. I'll read the prompt now. With an eye towards specific movements and epochs from the history of the left, what is the role and significance of intellectuals for the left? And our panelists, in the order they'll be presenting, are Mike Rodkin, who is a lecturer in community studies at
Actually,
UCSC.
now in Merrill College.
Wait, which? Okay, yeah. Long-term city council member and an ex-mayor of Santa Cruz. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Okay. David Lau is a poet and editor of the Lana Turner Journal and a lecturer at College 9 at UCSC. We have Keith McHenry, who's an anarchist and the founder of Food Not Bombs. And Gerald Smith is a member of the East Bay Democratic Socialists of America, Berkeley Cop Watch, and the Oscar Grant Committee, and a former member of the Black Panther Party. And, he'll be joining us shortly, but we also have an undergraduate here who's named August Carlton. They're an undergrad student at UCSC with interest in the Cold War, drug policy, technical death metal, and the Chinese Revolution. Each of the panelists will have 6 to 8 minutes to give their opening remarks, and I'll let you know when you're running out of time. We'll follow that with a quick round of responses so the panelists can respond to each other, and then we'll open up for audience questions. Without further ado, I'm handing it over to Mike.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate being invited to this event. It's a tall order to try and talk on this topic in 6 to 8 minutes, as you might imagine. So I'm just going to get into it. It's going to go really quick, my comments. So an effective politics requires a theory and a practice. My primary career has been here at the university, where there's a lot of theory and much of it not particularly helpful for thinking about actual practice in the real world. On the other hand, an awful lot of community practice that I see has very little, is not well informed by very much in the way of theory, and that, or at least any coherent theory. I'm going to make sharp remarks. Keith will probably, I know others as well, may object to some of them, but that's not on the basis of any personal animosity. It has to do with trying to make an argument about what's going on and this topic that we're on. So political work effectively integrates theory and practice. It should result in a strategy for action. And far too much of what community practice is involved in these days is little more than an expression of protest or outrage at a wide variety of abuses, but not a coherent strategy for actually accomplishing clear goals or struggle for equality, justice, environmental sustainability, or community well-being for everybody. So first of all, what's the left? In 1789, when Louis XVI was king of France, he appointed a kind of a mock parliament. They had no power. It's an advisory group. It had no power whatsoever, and he didn't pay any attention to what they were saying, so it wasn't really even advisory. And they got pissed off enough that they left the meeting that they were in. They went out to one of Louis's tennis courts at Versailles and set up a bunch of benches. And out there were the people, all the people who were opposed to the nobility. And so there was one group of people who were, a large group that were kind of represent, we call that bourgeoisie, but just to use common parlance, business people were one of the groups that were unhappy with the nobility. And the other were people who, mainly wage workers, people who had no business, had nothing to sell but their labor power. That included people who were very poor, people without any resources, but also people that were working, but not doing particularly well. And the people that happened to sit on the left side of those benches those are the people that were in favor of the working class folks, not the business people, and that became known as the left. And that's why we these days use the term the left. It's representing more the working people and people that are without the resources of owning businesses and that type of thing. In 1789, in that revolution against Louis XVI, there was theory. It was theory about republics, small r, republican virtues, the idea of representative government, the idea of democracy, the end of monarchy. And there was a number of important theorists. I haven't got time to get into all of them and stuff, but they were inspired by the movement of these folks who were actually out in the streets fighting against the monarchy. They also inspired that movement and gave it some sense of direction and goals and sort of articulated a bunch of ideas that really inspired the people out in the streets to think about what would be right, how society should be run, and so forth. By 1848, 1789, by 1848, there were three major political movements in Europe. One was the anarchist movement, the most famous of whom was Mikhail Bakunin. There was a group called themselves the True Socialists. Ferdinand Lassalle, he ended up being the founder of most of the parties that are now socialist or social democratic parties in Europe today. And the anarchist argument was you don't need government, that people can just sort of begin now to live lives the way that they want them to be in the future, and that we need to get rid of any kind of authority, that authority is like corrosive of anything that's having to do with human values. Ferdinand Lassalle's argument was that working people were becoming a majority. Most of Europe was peasants. And working people were becoming a majority, and that they were in a position where they could begin to actually take over these societies by first fighting for the franchise, for the vote, and then using that to actually have their parties elected to majority positions and begin to run society as the dominant parties in the various coalitions that might be formed. The third group was Karl Marx, and what founded what we now think of as Marxism. Sometimes using the word communism, using the word small c communism now, not for necessarily a particular communist party. So Marx had a theory of why it was that this growing group of wage workers who were taking over from the peasantry all over Europe, and as it turns out in our day, on the entire planet, in Asia and Africa and Latin America and everywhere else. The majority of the world used to be peasants, people that had direct access to the land. More and more it's people that have to work for a wage or a salary. 80% of the people in early America in 1780, 4/5 of the population, not counting slaves and Native Americans, but 4/5 of the rest of the population owned some kind of business. Didn't work for a wage or a salary. They had a craft shop or a farm or something else. And of course that's totally reversed today, where something like 4/5 of the population works for a wage or a salary and don't own a small business of some kind or something else. So there have been theories that develop around this around this question to this day about how theory should inform the political work that we do. Well, it's not going to be good enough to come up with a class theory that's based on the class structure of France in 1848. We need to look at what's going on in our own world, in our society, try and figure out some kind of a class analysis based on that, and figure out what is it possible for us to accomplish in terms of actually taking power and reorganizing society so it meets the needs of human beings that live in it. And that theory does not very much inform the kind of political practice that goes on. And especially, you think about this, if the politics we're involved in is basically mostly protest, there's lots of abuses going on in the world, and people are out there protesting against them, or perhaps providing services that are completely inadequate to meet the actual needs that are out there, but it's the best people are able to pull together on a shoestring. If that's the major practice that's going on, and that's what I see when I look out in terms of what's now constitutes the left, say in Santa Cruz or in the country, then it's not that that's bad. It's not like, oh, those people are stupid or it's not a good thing to do or they're evil in some way. It's just not enough. What needs to happen is some kind of a strategy that tells us, about a minute, a strategy that tells us how we could begin to actually think about reorganizing society on a different basis that's more humane and that actually meets the needs of working people. And I haven't got time in a minute, obviously, to wrap this up. I'm going to use some opportunity that goes in the rest of this to finish up the comments I would make. But I will say that I do think it's possible to have a practice that's informed by a theory that tells us corporate control is really the problem that we're up against. And we need to find a way to take power away from these corporations, partly through taxing, but not just through taxing. I think the municipal governments, the state governments, the federal government need to actually take over some of the things that capital operates and run those. I don't think we're going to get totally rid of all private enterprise or something, but I mean, I have examples. I'll give you one about the issue of homelessness, about what I think we could be doing to provide adequate homes for people, for everybody. So a home is a right, not just a privilege. And I think there are ways to do that with an adequate theory of thinking about how is it that we could take over from corporations and make that happen. That's the end of my time.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm handing the sort of invisible mic over to Mike. Oh, not Mike, David Lau. Yeah.
Okay, hi everybody. So I think that the basic thing I would want to say is that in the Marxist tradition, obviously intellectuals are very significant. And Mike was already kind of alluding to this because there's this sort of central importance of strategy. And so, now that could be thought about in any number of different ways, but one thing might be to think about would be, in a way, how the different social movements, political parties, historic blocs, whatever you want to call them, are almost judged in a way by the intellectual leadership they produce, and the intelligentsia of social and political movements in various national contexts has been of extreme historical importance. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind, that we're talking about a level of the class struggle. Intellectual development, the development of a movement intelligentsia is a facet, an important facet of the class struggle itself. So class struggle should not, as Mike's kind of getting at, it shouldn't just be judged by like people in the streets or like militant feeling or the ability of like a social movement to kind of consist for 6 months or a year. In a way, the development of independent leadership in intelligentsia is the sine qua non of a political movement. And you can look at any number of different national contexts, like the Philippines or Guinea-Bissau or France or the United States in the famed 60s, for example. So I think that's one thing that's very crucial to look at. I myself would consider myself and others to be part of the movement intelligentsia that's developed after the financial crisis since 2008. And I think there's been quite a number of different writers. Some of you guys may know them. Magazines. I mean, I would think of the Platypus formation, for example, as being today very distinct from what it was, say, during the Iraq War period. Just as an example of kind of how this whole post-2008 movement and the intelligentsia around that movement has kind of created a new day or whatever. Now, I myself also would be, just to speak to the present in a way, I would be critical myself of the movement and its intelligentsia also. I don't think it's enough just to kind of like rest on the laurels of what's gone on. I think obviously the Sanders campaigns of the last couple of election cycles and the arguments in DSA, I heard this was brought up, right? DSA was brought up, but I'm part of DSA also here in Santa Cruz, and yeah, just that whole kind of situation that's happened around that. There's been some various arguments about the relationship to the Democratic Party on the American left, and should there be a break from it? Should there be a quote-unquote dirty break? Are people familiar with these kind of ideas? Some of these ideas? Okay, so that's kind of like, you could say a movement strategy that's developed around Jacobin and some sections of the Democratic Socialists of America, some of the so-called caucuses. And then you have other elements of the DSA that are kind of further to the left. There's, for example, a grouping called the Communist Caucus. So anyway, but just to underscore and repeat the point again, I think it's very, very important to keep in mind how this is a crucial factor of class struggle, and in a way, we almost start to stumble into the whole problem of like, what is Marxism exactly, and how did Marx conceive of Marxism? How did he conceive of what he was himself doing? He conceived of himself as writing for a autodidactic, intellectual, working class movement. He conceived of that as being just the reality around him. And I think that the Marxist tradition, and by here I would mean people like Mike Davis, for example, the Marxist tradition still tries to think about that dialectic of the intellectual and the audience, and how the audience is itself intellectuals, and so here at the university we often have these very reified concepts and categories of elite intellectuals, and the chair of this or that, and specializations, and on and on, but the question of intellectual life, and I'm kind of stumbling into it like a Gramscian point or something like that. The question of intellectual life is very much central to the development of authentic working class movements. This is not some like elite thing. It's got to be like in the people, and it's a sign of the people, the captain they produce. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And now I would like to go and transition to Keith McHenry.
Okay, well, I'm Keith, and I started the first Food Not Bombs, and now there's 1,000 of them or more in the world. We're in like 65 countries, maybe 70 countries right now. There's probably at least 50,000 volunteers worldwide. And then the projects that spun out of them were like Homes Not Jails, Bikes Not Bombs, the Really Free Market, indie media, a bunch of those, many projects like that. So I joke with volunteers that the key to the revolution is successfully packing and unpacking vehicles and shipping containers, because that's really, we spend a lot of time doing that kind of things. But it's even though there's a lot of just showing up and doing stuff in Food Not Bombs, there was ultimately, in the beginning, in fact, there's a great book. God, what's the name of that book? By Sean Pierce from University of Northern Arizona. God, they taught the book. But it goes through the philosophy. You can email me, keith@foodnotbombs.net, and I'll get it to you. And it reminded me of those early discussions. So his focus was on San Francisco Food Not Bombs. And we developed a whole philosophy of how to organize, even though it's very loose at this point. But so we're non-hierarchical. Each there's 3 principles, which made it possible for it to go all over. But my roots come from, for instance, reading first Henry David Thoreau when I was in the 5th grade. That's how I got introduced to I switched from being a communist in the 4th grade to being an anarchist in the 5th grade as a result. and then there's a huge amount of literature and thought about non-hierarchical organizing from an anarchist point of view. And so it's not like we're anti-intellectual, although there are definitely a lot of anarchists that are anti-intellectual. That's not to, you know. So I'm going to go through 3 principles because they kind of show you a little bit about what the political theory is in some senses. That the food is always free, and vegan or vegetarian, it's free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober. That the second one is that there's no headquarters, leaders, presidents, directors, that each chapter is autonomous and makes its decisions involving the people that actually need the food or the other resources that we're providing, so that the group is all equal in making these decisions together as best as possible, although, you know, with humans, this is not always easy. And third, that we're not a charity, but we're dedicated to taking nonviolent direct action to change society so that no one has to live on the streets or eat at a soup kitchen. So those are what binds this 1,000 collectives worldwide is in a single focus. So part of our ideas is to do something for a long time and to practice. And so that's what we're doing. It's 42 years. We're like practicing, cooperating, and actually creating. So the underlying idea is to just create the society that we're going to live in and essentially either fight back against the society trying to stop us, or just, if they're ignoring us, which can be positive, just keep building and building and building until the lessons that we learned in real life by actually trying to meet each other's needs and meet our community needs becomes the way society slowly gets organized. I'm influenced by a book called Anarchists in the Spanish Anarchists in the Spanish Revolution, I think that's what it's called. Portraits of Anarchists in the Spanish Revolution. And they before the fight against Franco, they'd spent several generations working with the peasants to develop systems of how they would cooperate and organize and so on before they started fighting fascism directly against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And that taught me a lot about this longevity of doing these things for that, and rather than a vanguard revolution where we like take power right now by, and I've been involved in overthrowing things. For instance, Food Not Bombs famously was the group that spearheaded the overthrow of the Icelandic government, so that there's been things like that. But it's more like having a community of people that really that interact successfully about meeting one another's needs in the future. Now, it's really little now. I mean, like we only have, I think, about 20, 30 core members, really. Roughly half are unhoused, the other half are housed. We all cooperate together, try to come up with logistics. There's always huge problems, and you do have to go around the interference by the state. But we don't recognize the state. We don't cooperate with the state overtly unless it's just person to person to make sure the trash is picked up or things like that. But we're like when they try to force us to get permits, we refuse. We are happy to give them memorandums of understanding. They ignore those. We ignore their permit requests. We stay autonomous. So the more we are in no way like leashed by the state, that really, I think, is the underpinning of the philosophy of what we're doing. And I think that's growing. I think people have seen that the way the economic and political system is a complete and total utter failure that did not respond to COVID, for example. It was anarchists largely all over the world that were the people out on the front lines making sure that the people who were cast aside had food. We saw that in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, where the governments were immobilized. All they could do was repression. They could not actually make sure that the poorest people were able to eat or have drinking water, just like with here. We were the drinking water. We were the hand washing stations. We were the food. We were the clothing. We were the housing. We still are, in many ways, that for the marginalized community in Santa Cruz. Because the governments, whether it's the national government, which has no real program to end poverty and homelessness in the United States, or the California state government has no interest in appearing to resolve these problems, provide housing to every single person, which they could, that they don't have the political will, and there doesn't seem to be any level of disruption of their political and economic system to force them in a position to actually do that. So our strategy is just to do it ourselves. So that's why we took over abandoned houses and put people, moved families into them. That's why we created our own radio stations and ignored the FCC. That's why we do home, gardens without, just seizing land to plant food, things of that nature. So that's the political strategy that we have embarked on. And
Thank you, Keith. Yeah.
cool. Oh, I thought that's cool. You got a bell that's over there.
No, I don't think it's coordinated.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Up next, Gerald Smith, could you please give your opening remarks?
I'm sorry, comrade, I can't even hear you.
Oh, sorry. Up next, Gerald Smith, could you please give your opening remarks?
Okay. Life is strange, because I've worked with Food Not Bombs in Oakland and Berkeley, at People's Park. We did a normal feed. Now, I guess I am different from most people, ostensible Marxists, because at the same time that I was in one of the self-proclaimed most orthodox political tendencies, and that was the Spartacist League and the Bolshevik tendency. At the same time, the same person was a member of the Black Panther Party, and in fact, we had a breakfast program that we saw the need to feed black children, and eventually that was taken over by the national government. They actually began to provide breakfast in schools all over the United States after they destroyed our organization. Life is strange. So I basically am going to continue where Mike had basically ended, because I thought that his presentation was rational. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. And that is, but I just want to add to it, that is, a classless society is not the society we live in. We live in a class-divided society. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, there are different types of intellectuals, and I'll try to point them out. I think that one, let's say Milton Friedman, we could call an intellectual, and I think that I would classify him as a capitalist or a bourgeois intellectual. I would also characterize Henry Kissinger, who's come back on the scene a little bit, as a capitalist or a bourgeois intellectual. Finally, I want to spread the spectrum out a little bit, and I would say that Robert Reich, who was formerly the Secretary of Labor under the Clinton regime, he would be, I think, a bourgeois intellectual. He teaches at UC Berkeley right now. So then really the question is, okay, you're talking about bourgeois intellectuals, petty bourgeois intellectuals, proletarian intellectuals. Who would fall into the category of a petty bourgeois intellectual then? I would say, I said Cornel West might fall into that category. How about Angela Davis? She used to teach right here. Might fall into that category. Well, the proletarian's in trouble. Oh yeah. And the number of proletarian intellectuals, that is the people that work with their hands, or skilled workers, or even today I would include tech workers as proletarians. How many intellectuals do we produce that advocate for the liberation of that class? And that number approaches zero. And that is because what I talk about the left today, I thought that, once again, Mike did an excellent job in laying out the history of the terminology and what it, but today, what does left mean today? Well, I believe, and this is maybe I'm a minority, I'm used to being a minority in more than one sense, demographically, intellectually, all kinds of ways. I believe that the left has to stand outside of the Democratic Party, okay? Because the Democratic Party is, I don't want to surprise, is a capitalist party. So if you are, to me, that's definitional. If you are part of the Democratic Party, you have exited the left, by definition. So who is outside of the Democratic Party? And, well, now here I consider myself a Marxist or a scientific socialist at least, okay? Well, I kind of look at Antifada as being outside of the Democratic Party for the most part, even though there were members of Antifada who were also members of the Democratic Party. That was not the center of Antifada. The center of Antifada, that is the people who fought fascism consciously, were outside of the Democratic Party. Had to be, because the cops and the Klan go hand in hand. The Democratic Party protects the fascists. Think about that. I'll certainly entertain any questions about that. So not just the Antifada. So what you see is also after George Floyd was killed, there was an enormous movement. Over 25 million Americans, demonstrated against that murder by the state of a black citizen. I mean, it's ugly. In fact, by the way, there is right now on PBS a Frontline film that just focuses on that murder and the effect that it had on the city of Minneapolis. Well worth seeing. Frontline it's called, okay? But anyway, let's go back to our subject. So when we're trying to talk about intellectuals and the left, we first have to be clear what is the left. And unfortunately,
1 minute.
a 1 minute, oh, okay, I would like to just point out that a part of understanding the left is understanding that we're talking about the non-profit left. If you're getting money from the man, how the fuck you gonna overthrow the man? Come on, this is, well, to me, it is silly, the concept that we don't have a left-wing non-profit. Okay, so the revolution will not be funded. I'm going to stop right there, but I do want to say that here is a grassroots activity that I'll speak to later, and I wanted to refer to, and that is the occupation of Parker Elementary right now, is going on right now in Oakland. No, you won't see a lot. There have been some very good articles in the San Jose Mercury. There's one, San Francisco Chronicle. There's another, and I've been shocked at how decent the articles were, because they actually showed up, they talked to people that were part of the the occupation, and I certainly felt compelled to mention it here. I don't want to take our whole discussion in that direction because we are here to talk about intellectuals and the left. I consider myself a proletarian intellectual, and I want to say that there are problems in terms of the left. It is not dead, but melting. Let's go.
Yep. And up next, we will have August. Right here.
Well, I came in late, but I think it was a good time because I really appreciated the points that you were talking about with reference to, when we're talking about left intellectualism, it's hard to stay away from relitigating the many failures and the sexy history of the 60s and the 70s, organizationally speaking. What I liked in particular was the focus on the autodidactic element that we believe Marx wanted to imbue in his works. He was basically writing his works, obviously, for proletarians who had 18 to 20-hour workdays at best and were barely functionally literate, if even that. So obviously it was intended to be eminently accessible for the class he was writing to, and so that encouraged what I think that element of the degree to which he was writing to the sensibilities and capabilities of the proletariat leads nicely into what I was entertaining when I was thinking about what I would say here, which was trying to understand left intellectualism through the foil of anti-intellectualism, which has cropped up numerous times in various radical or ostensibly radical movements. The first place that the easiest target, almost too easy of a target, would be analyzing the many ways in which the Khmer Rouge went blatant left, right, up, down, and center on revisionism and completely corrupted the science of Marxism into something which was eminently laser focused on anti-intellectualism, on sort of romanticist traditional ideals of recreating the Khmer Empire, of genociding Vietnamese people, of which I am one, so I suppose I have a stake in that. And then I started to move on to other anti-intellectual currents, like the sort of tugging war between those who supported student inclusion in proletariat movements during the 60s and 70s New Left debates and the many splits that were produced there, like the split that killed the SDS. And in the other direction, the anti-intellectualism that ebbed and flowed during the Maoist period in China, which was extremely mercurial. So there was very little cogent, lasting positions on the nature of the intellectual. But I think that where you would want to go from there is you would want to see a lot of the other traits possibly worthy of our criticism, likely worthy of our criticism, that you could call comorbid with that anti-intellectualism. I could easily argue that the anti-intellectualism that the Khmer Rouge vigorously promoted went part and parcel with their anti-scientific romanticism and their delusional campaign to create this agrarian ideal socialist empire taking up the Indo-Chinese peninsula. Within it, I see, again, with this example, with the Cultural Revolution example and other examples on a smaller scale, that the autodidactic component of Marxism, which is extolled so often as one of Marxism's greatest strengths, is you can have any proletarian pick up this book and start chewing it down and develop their own analysis and become part of the wider movement that is applying this similar framework of analysis. And in these areas that went solidly anti-intellectual, you see this get warped into a sort of vulgar Marxism that is far easier to imbue with traits that Marx would have found revolting, like, again, ethnic nationalism and things of that nature. And so when we're treading into criticism of intellectualism, first and foremost, we have to understand why it is that we don't like the intellectuals in this particular instance. I mean, no one is safe. Yeah, no one is safe from criticism, should be at any time, but there is something worrying in the fact that anti-intellectual currents have not just acted initially with the far more palatable goals of burning down academia as we understand it now and things of that nature, all the way to, killing anybody wearing eyeglasses and things of that nature. But while I probably don't have enough time, maybe I have like 3 minutes on this one, I was also exploring generally what we see in intellectualism as it is endemic to the American left, especially as we were talking about like the new forms that radical movements, the intelligentsia have taken, like post-2008 and Occupy, the professional activist, or what they looked like back during the New Left. And this term does have some like romanticism that you might see within it, but I think there is something to it to say that given the fact that the matrix of the left, like in which it is growing in America, I lost my train of thought. What was I saying before that? Someone shouted out at me.
Talking about
Post-2008.
Okay, cool. There is something to it. I mean, not just something to it. I would strongly believe that like one of the first places we have to go is we're developing a radical revolutionary nexus that is within the richest, most powerful empire to ever exist in history. And as we're all eminently familiar with, the very act of having to live in the country that is responsible for by far the most pain and suffering on a global scale that has ever been seen in the entirety of human history sort of warps your mind a little bit, I'm thinking. It's not very good for your brain. And with the sort of comfort, it's like it's funny to say that there is comfort that you cannot escape by living here in the empire, but that comfort does, oh, of course I am, serve to, over-comfort you and over-civilize you in such a way that makes it impossible to develop effective analysis in response to world historical events and phenomena, because when you live in a post-industrial society that is focused on de-skilling the proletariat while continuing as best it can the exploitation of nations in the global south, then you have to start to look at ways to radically and maximally oppose the conditions that you are in at all levels, because those are the ones that are shackling your ability to produce more effective analysis. And that is very condensed and not a lot to go on, but it is also my general outlook on how we should look at intellectualism and intellectuals if we are to build anything resembling a meaningful and effective revolutionary current in the United States, in the empire.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all the panelists. Now we'll do responses in the same order you guys spoke in for the opening remarks. Hopefully these won't go over 3 minutes each. So to start, Mike, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, I appreciated the comments people made. I'm going to use my 3 minutes to make the point I want to make at the end of the introductory thing that just wasn't time for. I think we need to have an adequate theory of who, in fact, is the sort of agent of change, as a collective agent of change in the current period. And the idea, again, that it's the industrial working class, blue-collar workers by itself, I think, doesn't make sense in the world that we live in. One of the earlier speakers commented on, including tech workers along, I think it was Gerald, tech workers along with manual workers is important. I think if you look at the question of how do you mobilize that entire group, which is the group that's necessary if you're going to actually seize the resources of this society? What you cannot do is basically focus all of your energy on the people who are facing the worst abuses. Not that you should ignore them or that they can't address those issues, but if you go after those abuses and trying to either with service projects of one kind or another or protests against the abuses they're suffering, and all you offer to the rest of that large, growing sort of working class that on a global scale and here in America as well, if all you're asking of them is sacrifice, you got to give stuff up. You've got to do stuff. These people are suffering, and you got to give up what you've got. Just think about this. It's not a very effective strategy for organizing them or having them believe in a future that would be different than the way things are organized now. They're going to get defensive. They're going to, as they do, they're going to go as crazy as supporting Donald Trump. I won't go into it. I don't need to. Like how unself-serving that is for the people that are most of the people that are supporting them. Mm-hmm. But you've got to try and figure out a politics that addresses them. I'm going to give you in a minute here, a really concrete example. We've got to raise the resources that are necessary to both serve the needs of the sort of general working class folks as well as serve the needs of the people that are most abused. So in Santa Cruz, we could be providing some tiny homes, for example, instead of tents with bathrooms in them, modern sanitation at least, and on a scale. And we need resources to do that. And it's not going to happen through volunteerism alone. We need to make demands on capital about that issue. Some of them are done through taxes. A split tax roll that brings back 3/4 of the money that was stolen from people of California with Prop 13, so that basically keep the residential protections of Prop 13, but reimpose the old property tax structure on the commercial and industrial sectors. And another thing would be like going at the national level. When Eisenhower, that radical, crazy left-wing guy, Eisenhower was president, the average tax rate for the 500 largest corporations in America was 90%.
Wow.
Today it's 14%.
American Stalin.
Okay, 14%. Now, you can't jump back to 90 overnight, but we could build a movement that opens up the possibility of revising that tax structure. Even better example, insurance companies.
Please wrap your thought up.
Insurance companies in Santa Cruz make tens of millions of dollars on home insurance. We almost never, and that's fire insurance. We have less than one fire in a house a year in Santa Cruz. There's no payout from all the money people are putting in. We could offer people, the city of Santa Cruz could offer people home insurance at half the rate they're paying now. There would be a benefit for them, and we make enough money to actually build those tiny homes that I'm talking about.
Wow.
That's just a graphic example, but you need a strategy of who you're trying to serve. If it's just the people that are getting screwed at the very bottom of the pile, and you would say to the others, you're the problem, you're the enemy, you're not going to have a successful movement that's capable of taking over this society in the way it needs to be taken over. That's my point.
Thank you.
I agree with you, except the tiny homes.
Well, or apartment buildings, whatever you like. Let's have a collective decision about what would be the best home forms or something.
Yeah, okay.
Like
And
a
now,
prison cell. Then I love you. Okay.
yeah, and now David, please give your responses.
Who?
David?
I'm going, right? Okay,
Okay.
so,
Yep.
this is just following up on some points that were being made. I think one thing that we should all be thinking about, and it's kind of coming up from what Mike was just saying too, is just the question of a political party. Again, if we were to think about these kind of left-wing intelligentsias, in a lot of ways they were party intelligentsias, and today obviously we don't have a political party of any description that can really work as was once imagined. The Communist Party would work like a kind of a leadership apparatus for proletarian struggle. So I think that in a way we almost have to go back to that question. Again, this was already coming up in some things that Gerald was saying. It's kind of an interesting question, what is going on right now in the context of this post-COVID situation, political situation. It's interesting how on the one hand, we've had seemingly a mass experiment in UBI, where there was a lot of money flowing around to people in the form of enhanced unemployment benefits. We also have had, in a way, the wipeout, I would say the political wipeout of the Sanders campaign efforts to do something from within the context of the Democratic Party. I don't think that the people who participated in that have correctly registered the level of the defeat of the Sanders campaign, especially the second time around. And in fact, many people have interpreted, I think falsely, the Biden administration as being some kind of like progressive force. I think the other thing that we have breaking out, obviously today, which is raising totally different scales of question, is a big-time war in Ukraine. And I know your guys' last panel discussion was about this, but it really does raise a lot of questions about this whole recent period of the left and its intelligentsia, and in a way, the real weakness on many of those levels has been on foreign policy and on the U.S. kind of relationship to the rest of the planet, and on capitalism as a kind of ongoing empire. So, but now that's all probably going to be changing quite a bit. So anyway.
Okay, and now I'd like to hand it over to Keith.
Yeah, I'm fine. Because the global economy is generally collapsing, and looks like it's going to just completely collapse here in the coming years. That there's a huge amount of solidarity now amongst employed, housed people and the unhoused that is growing, because to me, I'm finding people are fearful that they're going to be joining the ranks of the unhoused. And so I think we are in a really interesting point of time where there is a lot of possibilities. And the other is this divide between the essential workers and the people that were quarantined, and trying to bridge that gap, because the people that are the essential workers that have been on the streets and out every minute of the entire pandemic are becoming politicized in not like a organized way, and there's an attempt by both the Democrats and the Republicans to hijack this frustration and anger and to divide the community into the quarantined and the essential workers at the same time, and to make that a kind of a division in society. And there's a huge movement of people that we at one point might have called right-wingers or Trump supporters or something, that have become seriously anti-corporate. Seriously. So there is this huge unity occurring amongst people who, amongst those of us that are the basket of deplorables, right? We are united in our hatred for the entire political and economic system. And I find it's very challenging, very interesting, and how large that is. So there's a massive grassroots movement in the United States against this totalitarian trend by transnational corporate power, and to defend liberty. And to a leftist, it appears to be like some kind of patriotic conservative ideology, but it's actually exactly the same as the left's perspective, anti-censorship. Because the censorship now is brutal. The amount of my friends have been removed from social media and is incredible. So, and then of course the digitizing and the fear that there'll be a central bank currency, and the elimination of cash, and the elimination of basically a lot of a gaining of control by transnational corporate power to control every aspect of our society, and it's happening so rapidly
Ask you to wrap these
that it is sparking rebellion, and I think that's where to look for it, is that connection between those of us that have been out on the streets the entire pandemic and never were quarantined and had to be on the front lines the entire time, and those that were quarantined that are leftists,
All right, I'm going to pass it over to Gerald Smith.
Okay. It's funny because let me try to correct myself here. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Because Keith and I was active during the entire pandemic. We small group of us worked the lines when they gave out food, for instance, at the various institutions, be they public school. We worked that line. Figured the masses can come out, we can come out. Now we wore masks, gloves, and I tried to. We still got a pandemic on. Fool yourself if you will. But I wind up being with you in that regard. But not on this question, brother. Deplorables unite. Given the low intellectual level in the United States, fascism is fact on the rise. And in fact, unfortunately, and it's totally irrational, but then again, fascism is an irrational current. It's growing. It's growing, and it's growing amongst the so-called deplorables. We have to develop a program to deal with these brothers and sisters just generally. And I thought that Mike's comments, very interesting and creative, except the small house bullshit. I went through it. We built them. I'm an electrician, so everybody comes in. Gerald, could you hook up to this? And I did. But after we finished them, no, that's not a solution. We need a real solution. Includes livable quarters, not little teeny prison cells. I thought I had to say, who is this guy? What is your name, bro?
August.
August, you very interesting. In fact, by him pointing to this Pot Paul stuff, see, I see the Pot Paul stuff coming up today around us.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. For instance, here at the, by the way, just to let you know, when you said that, in fact, Marx was current with his autodidactic methods, well, that's a fact. People don't know this, but in the newspapers in Germany, they printed a serial run of Capital. German workers grew up reading Capital in their local papers.
I'm going to ask
Not
you to wrap
today.
things out.
Not today. Not today. We have a problem. Oh my goodness. So, well, that's it.
All right. Yeah, thanks again.
I want to add some more later. But
Yeah, hopefully you can get it in the Q&A. Yeah, okay. So thanks again to all the panelists.
August. Forgetting August.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, August, would you please give your responses? I'm a bit tired.
I
Sorry
sure
about
would.
that.
Well, that was a great way to lead into what I was thinking about, because what I see as sitting at the center of us wondering what is to be done about intellectualism is that I have become increasingly convinced, seeing the developments of the DSA at a national level versus the chapters, seeing the way that so-called progressives in Congress and organizing electorally have kept running for the football and having it be pulled away at the last second every time. And it's like, how many more times are you going to do this? That has instilled in me a very, very deep sense of ideological, I don't want to use the term ideological because that's poison now, but rigor in thought and attachment to the principles of scientific socialism and of Marxism, because that's what you ultimately see when revolutionary movements finally fall upon their deathbed, never to get up, is when revision comes in, and that revision will clothe itself in necessity and will say that we are merely working with the scientific living basis of Marxism and expanding outwards from there. But again, this is that vulgar Marxism where it's just the chief ideologist of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Suslov, he was on the Presidium for 20 years. The way that he would win every argument was that he carried around a little Rolodex, and in that Rolodex was listed by category every useful statement Lenin ever made on any topic. So anytime he was in an argument, he would open up that Rolodex, he would find the appropriate card, he would pick it out and be like, oh, see, Lenin agreed with me. And that's the kind of lack of rigor that we're looking at when revolutionary movements are stabbing themselves in the stomach, is because they become unwilling to continuously pursue and work with the framework that they claimed to understand so well. And then they blame that framework and abandon it when things go wrong, when you start abandoning it, which is what we saw so tragically with any of the socialist or radical parties that tried to hang on worldwide after 1991 when all the help stopped, was they all, one being this strange group of semi-trots, semi-something else, I forget their name, that split off in the UK. They made a magazine called Living Marxism, and then it turned into something else. Yes, it turned into that other thing, and now they're just unapologetically a right-wing rag. We see so much of that when we abandon ideological rigor. We have to, and a lot of people interpret that as saying these workers who are often overworked and mentally ill, like I am both of those, can't possibly set aside the time to understand these things. That's very belittling to those workers, especially again since these things were literally written for the worker and the work. I'm closing up. And secondly, it's not even the point, because the point isn't that you should be memorizing Marx's every word so you can apply it to life. It's that you have to be able to stick to the framework. You have to pursue the framework. You have to remain scientific. So many of these errors arise when you stop being scientific, and that is the central error, and that leads us back to intellectualism and our stance on intellectualism.
Okay, now for the Q&A for real this time, I promise. Thanks again to all the panelists. We're now going to open the floor to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll call on you. All right.
Yeah, so thanks to our panelists for what's been a very lively discussion. I want to return a formulation that David made of the necessity of a political party, and this picks up from, where Mike left off in his opening remarks on 1848, which not too long after that, there's the creation of, the German Socialist Party, social democracy, right, where the intellectuals and the workers were merged, right? It's the intellectuals' guidance that will give a barometer of the party, such that will be a barometer of history, and also, lend the workers such that, their struggles don't only amount to trade union struggles, that they can go beyond this, right? That their intellectual work would also be simultaneously disciplined by the party. Now, in the sort of 1920s and 30s, right, with Stalinism, as had come up on the panel, the intellectuals and the workers separated, right? Most notably in something like the show trials and the expulsion of the many intellectuals and, dissidents, internal critics of the party, but that being said, there still are Marxist intellectuals after that moment, right? Which means that there's a simultaneous necessity and impossibility of being a Marxist intellectual, right? Or a leftist intellectual. Because if you're outside the party, you're not disciplined. So it's impossible in that sense, but because people are still reaching for it, and it's still a task necessary for world socialist revolution, and still necessary. And sort of, I want to ask all the panelists, what is the role of intellectuals without a sort of socialist party, which we haven't had for, decades, if not 100 years?
All right, who would like to address that question? All right, yeah, just go down the line.
Well, I mean, I would just basically start out by trying to go back a little bit to one of the points I was ham-fistedly trying to make, which is basically that we have to be careful about how we're conceiving of this dialectic of like masses, intellectuals, parties. We have to be careful how we're conceiving of this. In part, I say that because you could say that in the Marxist tradition and in broader left traditions as well, the self-activity of the working classes is itself something that demonstrates ideas and forges new pathways for critique and conception. So just to give a simple example, you could say that the Haitian slave rebellion and revolution basically made it conceivable for abolitionists at the time that there could be an immediate emancipation and not some gradual, eventual freedom for people who were enslaved. So it was the activity of the revolution in Haiti that actually broke open the frozen ideological seas of the abolitionist movement. And it was the influence of Haiti thereafter that basically, in all these different contexts in the Caribbean and the Americas, really turned the intellectual tide. Again, if we thought about the famous history of the Soviet Union as an example here, the form of the Soviet, of a worker and soldier council, as an instrument for constructing proletarian power and capturing state power, which is still necessary, I think. There wasn't some like theoretical conception of a Soviet. The Soviet actually emerged in 1905 in Petersburg, and Trotsky was its famous figurehead or whatever at the time. So anyway, I just think that's worth considering, that we've got to think about how intellectuals, because again, like what Gerald was saying, many intellectuals people are very fucking smart, but their whole way of perceiving and interpreting reality is fundamentally based on these bourgeois categories that they more or less take for granted, and they can't quite see what's going on, right? And so the intellectual approach of historical materialism or scientific socialism, whatever you want to call them, is in part a way of trying to understand the effectual reality that's going on around you, and ultimately to be able to interpret that and make sense of that. And then there's this dialectic with the party and the intellectuals and the masses and the unions and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, I guess I saw you want to comment.
Yeah, so that reminded me of a wider point that I wanted to make, which was that the vigor and rigor that I was talking about, that I think is necessary for the movement and for the party form to instill within it, I think is brought about by retaining the element of confrontation at all levels. Like, there is something that's not something to be dismissed when people speak of, left unity, that dangerous over-repeated phrase, or something even as unambiguously good as the solidarity among oppressed peoples. But I think that when people bring those things up, and I'm not saying necessarily that anyone here at all is guilty of this, it's just a general trend that I notice, it's that there is this expectation of somehow, through Demcent, for instance, of being able to resolve the critical discourse within the party and find a position by having lively debate on that position, voting on it, and then you remain disciplined in service to that position. But it still takes away from, and I bring that up because I see that as how a lot of people conceptualize left unity, something like it. But I think it harms the revolution and dooms it because it does not leave nearly enough room for the kind of unending, ruthless criticism that everybody should be hurling at each other at all times in left-wing spaces. Because in my opinion, I think that being forthright and completely honest and as ruthless as is necessary in your criticism of a comrade's position, of a comrade's behaviors, of a comrade's whatever, is one of the greatest expressions of solidarity that you can express, because you were saying that I can criticize you, you can criticize me, I am able to see what is worthy of criticism from you and know that you can digest that, and vice versa. It is an act of revolutionary love, it's an act of revolutionary cohesion to allow for just polemics to flow freely. I think that should always be preserved, and I think that's one of the things that many 20th century movements missed out on, and a few of the somewhat more successful ones actually were able to deploy more of a degree of, like, within the movement, retaining the polemic element. I'm very invested in the polemic element as central to maintaining revolutionary character. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Keith, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Oh, you're okay.
Unless you want to go first, I can talk to you.
You can go for now.
Okay. I was one of the 12 people that formed DSA at the national level. I've been a member of the New American Movement, a socialist feminist group of about 800 people nationally, pretty small little group, but much more activist than the larger Democratic Socialist organizing committee that we joined with. And at the beginning, the group had a coherent theory and intellectual sense of what the possibilities were of forming a kind of a left alternative party. DSA is the largest socialist group, you can argue how socialist they are or whatever, but the largest socialist group in America. And but I'm not active in the local DSA in Santa Cruz anymore, for a variety of reasons I won't go into. And I haven't run around, this is the first negative thing I've said about them since I stopped paying my dues. But there's not an intellectual perspective on what's possible. They take the Santa Cruz group in terms of, like, in other words, people will get involved in an election. Let's elect so-and-so to office. That's the best candidate, got the best politics, whatever. Or we should go down there and help provide tents for this group of people, or we should, whatever it is. But there's no coherent, even attempt that it's best. And I look at I get all the emails and everything. Attempt to really come up with a coherent kind of theory of what's possible, and the examples that I gave, whether it's small, tiny homes or not, but in terms of taking on a big, bold project and really imagining there's 550 cities in California. This home insurance thing I'm talking about would benefit all of them. But nobody's thinking at that scale. Nobody's thinking, what's a strategy that actually would reach out to working people? Because real wages have fallen in the United States from 1970 to today. Fallen. People have less purchasing power today than they did in 1970. The whole working class is downwardly mobile in this country. And if you want to know, there's a lot of other things going on with Trump, authoritarianism and racism and everything else, but at bottom, people are pretty fucked up and pissed off because the life is getting worse. It's not getting better. And so it becomes irrational, as Gerald was saying. But if you're going to form a party, but you can't be it's a contradiction in terms to think about a socialist individual. You're not tied to other people, forget it, it's ridiculous. But the idea that you'd have a party that coherently built theory and strategy over time and applied it to particular situations so that you entered a city council race with some idea other than let's be cannon fodder for this person's election or whatever, but actually a strategy for what you'd want the city council to be capable of doing, that is not happening. And DSA fell off that at the national level. I don't think Santa Cruz is unique in this way. I think these DSA chapters are sort of, they're picking up the kind of, it's liberal efforts in effect, and it's heartfelt, they're not doing bad things, they're supporting good projects and whatever, but it's lost the intellectual edge of imagining that we can form a party that would represent a very diverse and large new kind of working class that exists with tech workers and everybody else at a different level. That kind of thinking is not happening inside the organization. And I don't think it's happening in some other organizations, so I'm saying, don't join DSA, join that group. Well, without that, I think your point is well taken. You need a place to be having those discussions. You know, I'm having that discussion with myself and my wife, and I'm writing articles for the local, media and stuff about this on my own. That's not the way it happens. I mean, you need to be part of a group that's got to practice and that's tries stuff out and gets their asses kicked and then tries a different strategy and modifies what they're doing. That is not happening in a systematic way. And without it, it's very hard to imagine being in a position to contest for power. What you're going to do is help, you can ameliorate the problems, make things a little better than they are. That's nothing wrong with that. I might have my students doing that or do internships all the time, doing useful things for folks. But it's not the same as having an intellectual approach to what's necessary in the current period. And even if you're not going to be successful in a short term, what should we begin working on? What could we build? Where's this going? What's the direction of it? That is missing in the United States today, and it's the best I can see. And without it, it's very hard to imagine that intellectual input into this. So people are doing practice. The local DSA chapter is very active. They're doing a lot of stuff. They're being helpful in a million ways. But where's the intellectual activity that directs that in a way that actually would transform what's happening around us, as opposed to just one more time push the rock up the hill, another person's been abused by a group or something.
There you go.
That's my So I'd love to see that party, that you build it step by step and you start somewhere and it's not starting. That's what troubles me.
If I may, because Mike might get me going on here, because he be thinking, see, and I know we are not exactly in alignment on every point, but I see intelligence when I see it. See, the problem with the DSA, and I joined the DSA because I did not, it seemed to me, my main thing was working with young people. And so I worked around the teacher strike in 2019, sorry.
You're pretty old, but not that old.
That's all right. With 2019, we worked on that teacher strike, and we came really close with the community and bringing together the union with the community. And that's why when the school board came out and said we're going to shut down these 30 schools, there was a movement. That was the result of the work that we had done since 2019. And so you have now something called SLAP, which is Schools and Labor Against Privatization. But here's the point. What Mike said, he said, now look, let's just take this little thing about insurance, which is actually a big thing. Totally correct. But what's the problem? We have to maintain and defend the anti-capitalist perspective. So even on this level, what is the obstacle to doing, obviously, an intelligent, rational thing? Collectivizing on, local levels or national levels, the question of insurance, so that it actually, the company, capitalism, that's what's the obstacle. Hell, it's right there in your, well, it's not right there in your face, but for me, it's right there in our face. And that's the problem. You have to hate the capitalists, fuck them, let's destroy them, now. But unfortunately, we can't. Yeah, you can. So but here, let's look at the DSA. Right now, what we have is a situation where genuine socialists or people that are left-wing proclivity are leaving the DSA. Let's just take one simple thing, the Jamal Bowman situation. So Jamal Bowman is a black man. The first black man. Fuck out of here. He's a traitor. That's what he is. He's a traitor to the working class. He joined the DSA on on the falsehood that he was going to support some kind of vague socialist movement or whatever. AOC brought him in. And then the first thing he did? He voted for the Iron Dome policy. What is the Iron Dome? It is a defense policy for the Israeli state. Okay? In other words, he voted for a $1.3 billion program to support the United States taxpayers supporting Israel again. Okay? Well, I tell you what, I came alive for a minute, and I organized our local to vote to expel that piece of shit. Fuck him. All right, now you said fuck, you know. Okay, I'm not perfect, okay? I was very angry about that. I organized, we should expel. Wind up, there was 50 different locals within the DSA that voted to expel that piece of shit. 50 different locals, but guess what? We were not persistent. We were not consistent. And you talk about Lenin, I love me some Lenin.
Oh, yeah.
And I bet you he'd have stayed on that shit. I didn't. I just went on and, you know, I'm now dealing with SLAP and trying to organize this, occupation, and it's difficult, and we're always outnumbered, outgunned. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't realize that 50 other locals had voted likewise as the local that I am in, the East Bay local, to expel, to expel Mr. Bowman. Because he's obviously a traitor, not only to the working class writ large, but just in terms of his accepting our endorsement. You know, we should, a minimum, unendorse him. So, is my time up? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to...
Take as much time as you want.
Can I respond?
Okay, so the point I'm trying to get at is, so what did all of my little left-wingers do? They quit. I resign. Yeah, well, they glad you resign, you stupid fuck. Because now you resign and they ain't got no opposition. The DSA has thus moved further to the right and to basically water carriers for the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And I don't like that. I'm trying to organize inside of the DSA with a group called the Red Republicans. Somebody says it's a dirty break. There's no such thing as clean and dirty. You don't work for the master class if you claim to be a socialist. Okay? So that's the Red Republicans. I don't try to bring up all of the internal stuff with the DSA, but the DSA has the potential to do something positive. That, unfortunately, is not the case right now. It is becoming clearer and clearer that it is an instrument of the Democratic Party. Finish.
You want to respond?
Well, yeah, well, I just wanted to respond to Mike Rotkin, and I don't think it's true that the local DSA has no intellectual leadership or that it has no strategy.
Which local are you talking about?
The Santa Cruz local
Yeah, no,
one.
I'll be corrected. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, so, for example, were any of you guys here when Measure M was on the ballot? Some of us lived in town when Measure M was on the ballot.
Is that rent control?
Rent control, exactly. So we had this big movement to try to get rent control passed, and it failed. The Measure M is not the first time that rent control has failed in Santa Cruz politics, but then there were some city council people who got on that year. And they're a mixed bag, like politicians are, but there was potentially a city council majority for rent control, and then there was a very, very well-organized and strategic attempt by the part of the local Democratic Party and its various city council kind of flunkies and city government that they own too, to try to push out Drew Glover and Chris Crone. So that all happened.
Finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
There was a recall, Gerald. There was a local recall against 2 DSA-backed candidates over completely specious bullshit. It's like the Chesa Boudin recall. It was like the dry run for the Chesa. You guys know who that is? Chesa Boudin. He's the
DA in
San Francisco. It's like this former public defender who won office, and
it's a reactionary recall.
yeah, and so the right wing is again, a lot of local Democrats are against him too and whatever, and so it's like right-wing and local Democrats kind of in alliance to bring about a recall of this progressive DA in San Francisco. And so that already happened here in Santa Cruz. I can't even remember the year now. It was like 2019. Is that when Drew Glover was recalled? 2018, 2019?
Maybe 18.
Yeah, 18, 19. Yeah.
Maybe 18.
So, you know, Drew Glover is a young African-American man, young black man. He had been a union activist student at Cabrillo College where I used to teach. You know, he made some mistakes, maybe politically miscalculated, but I mean, you know, it's not like that was just all happening in a vacuum, Mike. You know what I'm saying? Like there was some real, some efforts to kind of crush the local initiative, the DSA. I think personally, the DSA is not running independent candidates on its own ballot line. Basically,
They're running as Democrats.
They're running as Democrats.
Say it, okay.
Yeah, and so without doing something like that, it's really questionable whether at a structural level it is anything other than a Democratic Party kind of pressure group. You know, I mean, that's arguably the role that Labor has been in for a long time, is a kind of junior partner in the Democratic coalition. I mean, obviously today the American left is in a real kind of shitty situation, so it's not a, now you have some grizzled old Marxists up here, so you don't want to be too negative yourselves, and you want to kind of participate in the movements that are going on around you, and in a way I think what you're getting from this panel that's really helpful though is in general a spirit of intellectual skepticism and doubtfulness and criticism of kind of the status quo. And that, to me, that's in the workers' movement. It's in different political currents in the workers' movement, the anarchists, the Marxist currents. You know, Marx, guys, he was really hostile to the left, or what he kind of considered to be the left. I mean, you know, Proudhon, very famously, you guys should read, I highly recommend reading The Poverty of Philosophy and other works that he wrote about Proudhon. And, you know, it's not this is not then to dismiss it to court all the things that anarchists did or something like that either, right? You want to be intellectually skeptical and doubtful and really get into the appraisal of past movements, but you also want to have a certain kind of optimism about some of these things, and you know, you want to keep in mind that people have organized in very, very difficult conditions and done things that seemed well nigh impossible, and given external factors, again, the world is breaking open because of warfare. The old world of China and Russia being integrated into the global capitalist system is starting to come apart. And a new world of increasing warfare and geopolitical competition at the highest levels, as well as a new world of economic relocalization and deglobalization. This is starting to be born. So there's all kinds of reasons to think that this whole political period that we've kind of been in now may be giving on to something else. Okay, so I just wanted to make that point too. Like, you're hearing a lot of skepticism, but it's good also to keep in mind the, you know, that's what has always inspired these working class movements in a way, is the kind of optimism of the will, the idea that, you know, organized, politicized, ordinary people can really change history.
Okay, does anyone else have some questions?
Thank you. So, as it was mentioned that Marx, and perhaps the Bakunin for the anarchist on the panel, was writing for an audience of autodidactic workers. But if, as Gerald says, working class intellectualism is dwindling, who is the left's audience today? And also, should in light of the fact of the absence of working class intellectualism, should the left, which could be called a largely petty bourgeois phenomena, at least sociologically, seek to produce proletarian intellectuals? Or what else would they do with them? Should they recruit the ones that are already there, critique them like Marx did, or or seek to maybe learn from them? In the case of the Haitian Revolution, that would be a Europe. Thank you.
What was the question again? I kind of got lost in the details there. Oh yeah, what was the question?
I've listened to many Platypus panels online, and all these questions are so long, and then I wrote a really long one, and I feel kind of embarrassed about it. So basically, what is the left's kind of role in relationship to working class intellectuals?
Given what Gerald was saying, Gerald's point.
Given the point that they're dwindling. There's not a lot of working class intellectuals,
Well, but there is, I would say today, just to respond to that, there is a very widespread popular sense and idea about inequality. That's hard won. That's not from nowhere that people have this idea about like the 99% and the 1% and and things like Mike's bringing up taxation. Again, like you guys can't imagine what California used to be like. This was like the heartland of anti-tax politics, and tax revolts just characterized decades of policy. So those are things to be encouraged by, even if they're not. I mean, in a way, we can't just assume. I think this has been brought up already, that we can't just assume that something like the industrial working class at the point of production is going to return. This is a point in this piece that has just come out in Sublation magazine. We can't just assume that something like that's going to return. There's going to be all kinds, hopefully, of new politics and ways to connect with people. We have the internet and these phones, and we've seen maybe kind of like lame examples so far of that petering out, but it doesn't mean that it can't still be picked up upon. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interest in things, even if the DSA is having all these internal problems and coming up against some real growing pains. There's still there's lots of things out there about socialism, and Platypus seems to be doing well here on campus. I couldn't have predicted that 10 or so years ago, when there were much more kind of like autonomous Marxist and anarchist currents among the students who were here and politically active and intellectually active, So I think in a way, the populism of the time has to be a guiding spirit right now, given how dormant things can look from an older school kind of perspective. Again, just to be a little hopeful. Just to be a little bit hopeful.
I have to say, I agree with that. I think it's a mistake to sort of make these rigid categories where you sort of imagine that, the intellectuals in the working class have to be somebody in a factory. I worked in a factory in Baltimore, Maryland, in a Ford plant making seats for Ford trucks.
Yeah.
But that's not the total working class. The working class today includes college graduates who are going to work for a wage, and as Keith points out, might find themselves living in a tent. In fact, I have students in my class, too, this quarter, who live in a tent. Not the same tent, they live in tents. And, so they're quite capable of intellectual analysis. They write coherent and thoughtful papers about things. I think the faculty here don't do it much, but the job of an institution like UCSC can be to sort of get people thinking about how to apply their intellectual talents and abilities to real problems in the world. To not simply buy into the narrow definition of a career in a profession. You pick your major and that's your career. And one thing, that doesn't even work in the real world anymore. People are changing their careers 3 times before they get to be 50 years old. So I share this thought, that we shouldn't be thinking about, well, there's no intellectuals or the capacity for intellectualism within the working class. I think it's there. It needs to be developed. It needs to be worked on. It needs to be encouraged. what troubles me is when you get this kind of anti-intellectual stuff that our friend here was talking about, where people who start to express those ideas are treated like, oh, shut up, let's just go do the work.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember back in STS, back in the end of the 60s, where people would have this debate and they start to get into some serious analysis of where we should be going around the war in Vietnam or some other issue, and somebody would just say, oh, shut the fuck up, and we're going to go take the building over, and they had no strategy. It's just we're going to like go kick somebody. Militancy replaced political strategy, and I think that can be overcome. I think that needs to be developed. I think there's capacity for that. It doesn't happen by itself. It takes people working to develop it and try and encourage it and find ways to make it happen. But I do work in the community with people who are not college educated and stuff, and they're not idiots. They're quite capable of thinking quite critically about stuff, but it needs to be fostered. It needs to be developed. You need to have a group that you can develop that stuff with. I mean, anybody can learn to read Marx, but right now you go by yourself and pick up Capital, which I tried early on, gave it up. It took me another 5 years to get back to it because it seems impenetrable. You don't know how to get started. We haven't got the preparation for it or something to make it happen. So I think that I'm not pessimistic about the possibility of developing an intellectual aspect within working class movements and activities. My problem is when those movements themselves kind of discourage it and shut it down and suggest that it's a waste of time to discuss these kinds of things or something. As let's go do something. Let's go give somebody a sandwich. I mean, again, people need a sandwich. It's not bad to give them one, but it's not going to get us where we need to be going. And Keith, I thought, did a good job of explaining that his anarchist approach to stuff is not just feeding people. It's part of a strategy that's going to lead to a certain, we might disagree about how it's going to work, but that's what's needed, whether it's going to be a Marxist approach or some other kind of way of looking at this stuff, is connecting these ideas about, thinking strategically about getting somewhere rather than just like, let's do what feels good in the moment and, oh, we helped, we were helpful. That's going nowhere.
So I think the United States is essentially like Pol Pot in a certain sense, in that it's anti-intellectual, because it's dumbed everybody down using like mass media and propaganda and all that. And so we've erased the idea that we could start thinking this way, and it's been intentional. The other thing I find is interesting is a huge percentage of people don't actually read. They can't read. They don't know how to read. They physically cannot read. Okay. And a lot of the people who live in the streets are people who, because they can't read and didn't learn to read, are not, can't fit into this.
They're not employable.
Yeah, they're not employable. They can't even do the most basic things because there's been and that's where this. Taxing people based on their owning of property has meant that the rich neighborhoods have better education, and those people do end up getting to learn and read. And the people that, I was in I think it might have been my junior year of high school. I was the only one in my history class that could read one word in the entire. And we had two books, one for the professor and one we passed around. And I felt embarrassed that I could read the entire sentence because I was the only one in the room that could read the entire sentence, right? So, and I was concerned that if I read the entire thing, I would be knifed in the back when I left the room, because it was a very violent high school. With a lot of armed conflicts internally, plus a weapons bazaar that you could buy these guns and stuff for the men's room and so on. But, but I do think a lot of people, there are some, to me, because the society is so rapidly collapsing, and I think the conflict in Ukraine and sanctions and so on, it's amazing. The people, I don't know if the people in power in the United States thought this through, or they're just so arrogant that they don't realize what is going on in the world.
You got that.
Some kind of combination, or how much is the CIA and FBI and Mossad and Chinese secret police and all that manipulating events? We got the FBI on Food Not Bombs like all day, every day, man. I have to kick out infiltrators all the time. We are like, it's unbelievable. I'm getting, well, tomorrow I meet with a person who got 19,000 pages of FBI documents, of which I don't know what the percentage is about food not bombs, but even the 500 or 600 more pages it's just unbelievable, the coercion. And then when you look at the situation of the recall of Drew Glover and then the opening the door, obviously was a really clear strategy to open the doors to hedge funds to take over Santa Cruz. So the people that just evicted us from the one parking lot that we had to move into, they're like a hedge fund out of Delaware,
And this was on the back of these recall.
Yeah, and
city
they
council people. The people
That's
came
right.
in on the recall.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Yeah, the property speculators were doing this nationally too, or globally, because we were seeing this in Rochester, New York, same thing in Buffalo, same thing in you could see it like it was a global strategy of essentially building parking massive amounts of stolen money from us through the CARES Act, for instance, and that happened, and and so on. But I do think we made huge headway with Occupy, even though the corporate media was trying to say, oh, we didn't have a message or anything like that. I think that did help set the stage for a class analysis that was sort of
That's true.
wasn't around.
99%, baby.
Yeah, it wasn't around before that, and I think that the Bernie campaign and stuff provided a lot of hope, but I think it was great that he sold out and became because it's disenfranchised all these people who somehow thought there was hope in the Democratic Party. So I think the Democratic Party is essentially eating itself, and there's this whole vast world of Americans and of people around the world that don't have any attachment to any of the old systems that were happening. They're just struggling. And I think once they kill the economy completely, and everybody is so freaking desperate, that's where we can form an idea. Now, the thing that I found interesting is I've been going to these very large meetings of activists that are much larger than any left-wing meetings of activists in Santa Cruz County that are trying to develop a strategy themselves. But their analysis is some of the people are thinking that Nancy Pelosi is a communist, and that's where the direction that things are going, is to communism. And so there's this lack of political language that's occurring, where everybody puts these labels on everything, and the left does it on things, and and then I don't think we realize how much manipulation is happening covertly by the FBI itself. I mean, it's hardcore. What is happening, and the fact that the FBI has infiltrated all the far right groups and Nazi groups in this country and manipulating them, and they're in Antifa and all that, manipulating them, and they're trying to get battles before rise of Hitler between the left and the right, gun battles happening in Portland and so on. So there's this huge dynamic where that is an opening, but that the people in power are trying to exploit, of course, for their own ends. So.
So, one question?
Oh, I still wanted to respond
sorry,
to
my
the
bad.
intellectual.
Why don't we get a couple more questions out?
I'm going to go to the restroom, but that doesn't mean I'm not
Why don't we get
interested
a
in
couple
what's
more
happening.
questions out?
You gotta
I'm
go to
old with a
bathroom?
bad
You going to the bathroom?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, let's run. Everybody, don't do anything. Two of us are going to the bathroom.
Oh my gosh.
Remember, we're old with prostates. Come on.
Be right
You
back.
had a question?
So I ask the question now, or?
Yeah, just
we
go
can-
for it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I think, as Keith was saying earlier, there is this kind of growing awareness of 99%, 1% dichotomy that you'll see even on people who vote Republican in the United States. And Gerald was kind of saying, yes, they're not on the same page as the actual deplorables, right? But I'm wondering, what can intellectuals do to make these people who are very right-wing in the U.S. kind of aware that they have common symptoms to
people who also are experiencing these same problems, even if there's like a political divide, because they're complaining about the same stuff. You'll see like these QAnon people kind of pointing towards the deep state or the elites, right? There's some kind of nation political awareness. How can intellectuals direct that towards what's actually happening and provide a Marxist framework for these people who are very resistant to it and, you know, socialism?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, let's get some other ones out. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is specifically for the ones who do.
Oh, okay.
But adding on, a lot of the like deep state stuff that you're talking about has a lot of its roots in anti-Semitism. So maybe if you could address like, is there any way that we could really undo that and like within like right-wing spaces? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think the cat's out of the bag on that one, sadly, but
Go ahead, and then one more. There was another question. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of like goes alongside like the role, like everybody's talking about the internet, but like I don't know, like how do you guys feel about like utilizing like social media platforms as like forms of like mobilization and as forms of like disseminating information? When that's where like, you know, you guys are saying that like nobody reads, but I mean people read, but they just like read everything like on social media, right? And like in very condensed forms. And so like how do you guys plan on like, yeah, just like disseminating that information to like the people and like in a way that's not like vulgar, you know, the way you were talking about, but like in a way that's like consumable, I guess. Or is that like something you want to avoid? Is like that just being like easily consumable? And if that's like what you're trying to avoid, like how do you do that when everything is so consumable nowadays? You know, like everybody gets their information off TikTok.
Well, I feel at least somewhat uniquely equipped to answer that one and tie it in to the other questions. Because I'm on like my 8th Twitter account now because they keep trying to get rid of me, but like I've had a large presence on Twitter for a while, and my account I don't really consider it a particularly useful or important account. I just shitpost, really, is the most direct way I can say it, and yet for some reason the experience that I have continued to have over the years, over and over and over, as somebody who has an audience of like 40,000 people, what it is like, I'll be shitposting and shitposting and shitposting, and then someone will come up to me and like, hey, you're the reason I started engaging with Marxism. I was just like a lib, and you got me to read the German ideology just because you talked about it in a shitpost, and I wanted to go look at it. And so I started connecting that to what I think is my general pedagogical outlook, which is that I am incredibly unfond of any teaching style, especially when it comes to any teaching style that is intended to generate and help grow consciousness within an oppressed person that specifically focuses on trying to hold their hand through it. Because on first level, you get the obvious problem is how much is this being dumbed down, what has been designated the wheat versus what is the chaff, and how pure is what is going down to the person. But also, a lot of it seems to be contingent on an assumption that the person who is learning is incapable of understanding it at this level that it would be necessarily put out. Now, obviously, you don't want to spam them with a terminological barrage and like totally overwhelm them and stuff. But I think that it is super duper duper important to always meet your audience at their level by just like trusting, for instance, that your audience are smart enough to read context clues, to make inferences, and to Google things and do their own research. It's not to say that like you would totally like, you know, oh, Google is free, not none of that bullshit, but more just trusting in the capabilities of your audiences as learning people, because we need to undo what is arguably a very colonial model of teaching, which is the teacher is full of information, the student is bereft of information, and one must transfer into the other, when really it's essential to the whole process, to the process of materialist analysis and dialectics, to have that constant, interplay going on here, and that's sort of what I integrate into anytime I'm trying to teach people stuff. So to circle back to the stupid Twitter shitpost stuff, that why I think that works, even though it shouldn't, and I think it's stupid and doesn't have much value, lies in the simple fact that it's even if people aren't necessarily tuned in, I think people generally have a good sense of bullshit and of when you see them with like if it's one-on-one, not like in a crowd, but like one-on-one, I think people have a good nose for that. And if you're going to treat somebody as dumb and not capable of learning something, they're going to internalize that as, okay, this is above my level, I'm not going to learn here. So something as simple as me just being a silly doofus on the internet just makes it clear that I'm like not placing myself above people because there's no reason for me to. So then when I spew out stuff and then occasionally there's a nugget here or there of like, oh yeah, the German ideology, oh yeah, Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, stuff like that, then people actually pick up on it and somehow derive value from that.
Yeah, but people, like, I don't know, like, I have homies that like I'll talk to them at the skate park and they'll be like, yo, like, check out this stuff that I found off the YouTube comment sections. And it's just like images of like Atlantis. like I'm saying that, I mean that like, not that it's, you like will dumb someone down by like explaining it to them, but I mean more like, there's, like, you guys were talking about like populist rhetoric and all that, like, if that's a lot more consumable, and so that's what people are consuming, right? And so like it's like, how do you fight against that, and how do you stand like above that? Like how do you get more people consuming what like what you want them to consume? I guess that's not like.
Let's get. There was one more question, right?
Sorry.
Didn't you also have a comment or question?
Actually, David, I don't really like stack questions. Platypus generally doesn't take stack
Yeah,
questions.
no,
I've said that.
I
I'm
have-
sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
But you had your, like, I know you had a question earlier, like, just to start out the stack. Like, what was your question? Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, so the question was, because it's a total fact that life in America is getting worse for everybody, and you have these people who are Republicans, like hard right-wingers, pointing to things like the deep state, pointing to things like the elites, kind of recognizing this 1%, 99% divide, right? What can intellectuals do, and can intellectuals do anything for these people to make them aware that their grievances can be addressed by socialism, by a Marxist framework, or does it have to be intellectuals for this huge right-wing contingent in the US?
Get away from them fucking Democrats.
Yeah.
I don't know that this is like a popular response to your question, but to me it's pretty profoundly important to consider that work needs to take place at a number of different levels. Part of the work is kind of educational work in the sense that people need access to a body of knowledge that's there. It's not information transfer, like, I have Karl Marx in my head and I'm going to tell you what he had to say because you can't read it yourself or something. But where people actually are sort of introduced to some ideas they haven't really thought about before and made those things happen. But one of the levels that's really, and another level is, which we'll have a fight about up here in the room in general, to what extent should we be worried about fascism and thinking about the importance of some defensive strategy that holds it at bay, even if it's not where we want to go or something. I wouldn't want to put all my energy in that. I think that would be ridiculous. But the most important level for me, and I don't know how to translate this into the world of social media. Someone, smarter than me and that's more in social media than I am. I'm an old school guy. But is grassroots organizing. What made Santa Cruz move? Santa Cruz was maybe the most conservative town in California. It certainly was in the top 10 most conservative towns in California. John Birch Society ran the place. The Ku Klux Klan marched in the streets here in the 20s and 30s. It's like really right-wing town. And when we moved in a more progressive direction, and not that everybody is all progressive, everybody that calls himself a progressive is necessarily progressive, but it's a very different place than it was when you had people who voted against. There's a guy on the city council when I was on it that voted against the entire budget because it had social service funding in it. He didn't just vote against the social services. I won't vote for a budget that's giving these lazy bums stuff, whatever. That's how conservative. And he was in the majority of the council. People like him since the founding of the town on some basic level. Business people, property owners, and so forth. And the shift towards more people with different backgrounds, is school teachers and professionals, and even blue collar workers. A plumber, we were on the council for a while and stuff. Michael Hernandez. That transformation only took place because people went out into neighborhoods and didn't go out there, and it wasn't at the level of preaching socialism or talking about like the socialist alternative or the way things could, or my insurance plan or something like that. It was going into a neighborhood, knocking on doors and talking to people about, well, what's your experience? We were focused on healthcare as an issue. What are your healthcare needs? Are they being met? How do you think we should solve this problem? And you start off with people slamming doors in your face, and then eventually you make some inroads, and you do a bunch of grassroots type stuff like neighborhood picnics to have people start to meet the people that live across the street from them who they've never talked to. They say hello in the morning, but they've never had a conversation. And that's a long-term strategy. I mean, you don't do that in 6 months. The West Side Neighborhood Group that really was the key to transforming the Santa Cruz City Council, we took 2 years before we even had a meeting of the West Side Neighborhood Group, where we just met in little groups, as Cesar Chavez did, with the farm workers. You start on a really small scale, getting people to talk to each other. It takes a huge amount of patience. You're not telling people what they should be concerned about or what their problems are. You're learning to listen to them about what they think is going wrong, and then you listen to it and get them to talk to each other. And you discover that you don't need to tell them what the answer is. They're not idiots, but they've given up. Their view is, it's a mess. I can't do shit about it, and I'm just going to put up with it somehow. When you get people together, they start to think, well, now there's 2 of us, or there's 10 of us, or now there's 50 of us, or whatever, a couple hundred of us eventually in the neighborhood group. That kind of grassroots organizing really gave people an opportunity. It was never socialist in its character. It was anti-corporate, against the medical establishment. And there was included Republicans and Democrats in this neighborhood group. The medical establishment doesn't care about us. The doctors that are running the clinics and stuff, we can't get into them. The hospitals don't care about our needs. Nobody will take my Medicare card in Santa Cruz. And you start to work with people, and it takes a couple of years to build something. But in that process, people start to they discover their own intellectual abilities and the capacity to analyze what's happening to them. It helps to have people put input into it. That's, again, the role of intellectuals in relation to those movements. But it's not like being directed by intellectuals. It's the neighbors themselves begin to discover this. It also can take place in a workplace. It doesn't have to be a neighborhood. But it's got some kind of, from my experience, a geographical base, a place where people are together, working or living together. And I don't know how this is an intellectual problem that needs to be addressed. How do you translate that into the social media? I mean, MoveOn's trying to do it, not successfully. I think there needs to be an answer to that question, is all I'll say. And I don't know what that answer is, but that's worthy of some serious thought about how do you take the models of grassroots organizing, which empower people to look at their own problems, not as you tell them what they are, but as they feel them, and begin to do something and learn their own power through that process. I think that can be done through social media, but I don't know how the hell you do it. I think that's a problem for people on the left to begin figuring out. How can that be a space in social media where that can happen?
If I may, unless you...
It's my question this whole time has kind of been tied to what you said and what you guys are all saying. I was going to ask, or I guess I should start off by saying that Keith mentioned that the FBI has has their eyes on his organization, and they have infiltrators. So with social media, you can, or I guess the government can keep logs of everything that's going on, and then they can censor. You mentioned that you've had 8 Twitter accounts deleted. So if they have this ability to keep tabs on us, and we're just giving them this information, even if it's in an attempt to educate others, how do we conceal those or reconcile those 2 points of 1, we're being targeted, and then 2, but we also need to educate people. So how do you use social media for your, I guess, intellectual motives without also putting a huge target on your back?
To some extent, I accept the target. I just think I've been acclimated for so long as somebody who is a racial minority, an immigrant, queer, disabled, pretty much every checkbox on the hate crime report file. So I'm already okay, so I am living in an empire that is actively hostile to human life and is doubly actively hostile to my kind of human life. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I am already, regardless of what I do, I am hated phylogenetically. So where I move from there is, it's sort of, There is a lot of scariness, to put it lightly, that comes with actually accepting what it means to be a revolutionary. I forget who said it, but the quote was, I think it was Hugh Newton, but I wasn't sure, that accepting being a revolutionary means accepting that death is imminent.
Revolutionary suicide.
Revolutionary suicide. And it doesn't mean like, going out and martyring yourself or anything like that, but it does mean that there is, like, from the outset, you have to give up, and giving up shouldn't have a negative connotation, because it's giving yourself up because you truly believe that whatever it is, whatever your role is, whatever you can contribute here, whatever you can do here, is something you believe so strongly in that you are willing to accept that the often, not always, but often inevitable result of going up against the apparatus of the empire is possibly unimaginable pain for yourself and your loved ones, and suffering as you do party work, as you do work to help the people, and stuff like that. And as for the nature of that work, I mean, what I really wanted to say earlier to one of the previous questions was, like, with regards to the hunger for the easy to consume, often misinformed, often bourgeois culture content, is that you have to find a way to remove the hunger. In the same sense that artificial sweeteners are bad for your gut because the gut bacteria there get specifically dependent on it and are able to metabolize it, but not as well, and start rejecting regular basic sugars like glucose and fructose. You have to aggressively counter that in such a way where I'm going to drop that metaphor right now because I don't know how to work it in, but
But it was close.
it was close. I just don't know how to really phrase it because I don't know enough about gut bioscience to do
You're
it.
in the wrong classroom.
But
That's over there.
but the way I see removing that appetite is that the way that I have seen so many people transform over the past several years. For myself, I was a radical by the time I was around 13, but I know so many people who only blossomed into it after Trump or during lockdown, massive world historical events that forced some people to start making structural critique. And a lot of the people who seemed most slated into it were the ones who suffered the most. And that seems like almost a trite observation to make because, yes, we're talking about the proletariat. We're talking about the downtrodden of society. Of course, they're the ones who are also going to be the most traumatized and the ones who are going to start to see themselves as most external to the system. But I think that, and I would want to pursue the part of that where I said, like, being subject to those abuses, to the kinds of abuses that are inherently afforded upon you if you're like disabled or a minority or something of that nature in bourgeois society, in the empire, taking the part of that where you get this sort of detachment. I would like to separate detachment from alienation because alienation can produce that detachment, but detachment is a separate thing because once you start feeling detached from the society that is brutalizing you, that is murdering people that are like you, things like that, then that gives you this extremely, tremendously good window on developing structural critique of the entire system, rather than being solely focused on the immediate conditions of your survival, of your family's survival, things of that nature. And I feel like you can effectively extrapolate that. You can extrapolate the part of it where it's like, okay, so I've been brought to face all of these things, and that's how I got here to the conclusion that the system is rotten and must be burned down. For people who don't necessarily fit into those groups, I think that what we have seen is, like, even in places where revolutionary consciousness did not fully develop, there was where you started to get people who don't necessarily have those traumas and those histories of being abused and things of that nature, is when you force them to be brought to bear to like the horrors of what is going on right now, essentially. And this is something that I'm still personally exploring a whole lot because the very concept of digital culture and the acceleration of culture, of society, and of government is incredibly fascinating to me and something that I like to explore a lot because I get this sense that perhaps the only way I can personally say I know of that I could see Americans, and it's worth acknowledging that anybody who is Americanized is automatically brain poisoned. That's just inherent fact. We're the dumbest, craziest people in the history of humanity.
Say it.
Because we had the misfortune to be put in an evil fucking empire that turned our brains into tapioca. And I don't remember where I was going before that.
Can I
You ain't got to
make
go
a
nowhere
comment?
else. You landed
Keith, go
right
ahead.
there.
Yeah, on the social media thing, Food Not Bombs has tons of social media. I don't know how many Facebook pages and stuff. But the way that we have two different ways of dealing with things. First of all, our main thing is to get you to come to the action, whatever it is, and to share images of action so that people all over the world see your actions, and then they do it like their thing. So even though we're under surveillance, it's not a problem. Then the other thing is, I remember in Southern California, like in the early 90s, there was this meeting, California-wide Food Not Bombs meeting, and we wanted to identify ourselves as an anarchist movement. And I successfully argued that was probably not wise, because the reality is when you do Food Not Bombs, the most important thing is not whether you're called anarchist or not called anarchist, but that the qualities that are anarchism are what you are doing when you're volunteering with Food Not Bombs. So that's at the essence. And then on the area, I can point, there's one of the flyers over there where it's about the FBI claiming we're a terrorist group at a University of Texas, Austin event, which is one of many times. If you turn the back side of that flyer, it'll give you an idea of what you have to go through if you are serious about organizing. It's a drawing I did after my third time in a stress position cage in San Francisco during the period where I was facing 25 to life. And I wake up every morning with my face hurting really bad because they tried to kill me on April 29, 1992 with a club between my eyes during the Rodkin King uprising. And I go to medical stuff endlessly since now 30 years I've been struggling with that with several surgeries and so on. But as you can see, I'm still pretty chipper, and I get out there every day. Yeah. And the government is fantastic in a lot of ways. So, for instance, the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, which originally declared us one of America's most dangerous organizations on August 29, 1988, banned me from employment in the United States in September of 2001. So I'm not allowed to work. And that gave me this amazing amount of freedom so the way I would get money is I would have to give a lecture at a college, get the students to give me the money before the IRS and the FBI found out. And that's what I just did. And that's what I've done since September of 2001. And then I've been able to live without a Social Security number for most of my life, and just done that. And I was able to even travel around the world without having any attack. I was able to harass Nancy Pelosi's office into giving me a passport without Social Security number and so on, because they're just trying to get rid of me. So that was fantastic. I think it's just living the way. Are we ever
want to respond?
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Just back to this whole thing about like the reactionary, kind of working class of the United States, and so I think it's just really important to keep in mind where we're coming from in this society, which is a society where the Cold War was fought internationally, but it was also fought domestically. And one of the big consequences of the long anti-communist hysteria, which is basically the entire length of the 20th century in this country, is that people are turned against what are the names of the best kinds of politics, in my opinion, and the kind of politics that have been translated into every language in every country and every continent, and brought about major political movements. So that we got to acknowledge that that's where we're coming from. Now, at the same time, it is worth thinking about the importance of capitalists, having an analysis of the capitalist system, having a class perspective. I think that's really, in a way, the difference between what I would consider Marxism and what is the contemporary left, is that they actually don't have a class perspective. They have basically a kind of identity politics perspective.
They're not
and,
leftists.
Yeah, and so there's a non-universalist set of ideas and programs. There's a focus on who's the most marginalized kind of discussion without thinking about the universal dynamics of wage labor and how every person in the United States, given the limited social safety net, is just a check away from major catastrophe. So I think, in a lot of the heartlands of the U.S., the good word of this kind of anti-capitalist perspective is really important to still bring to them. Now, if we were going to think about what's going on today and what Marxism kind of means today, I mean, one of the things that we should all be very aware of is that the various very severe crises of the capitalist system that we've been through and that are kind of coming onto the horizon now are not necessarily going to give way to something else. In fact, given how weak organized political opposition is in the United States, in Western Europe, in Russia, in any number of countries, it's very hard to see how things get better in some kind of immediate way. And so that's why it's very important to think about how we can organize a very large, very big, very intellectually astute politics of class struggle and new political parties that are organized around class analysis and anti-capitalist perspectives. Because if we don't have a large organized opposition, capitalism can simply grin and bear its periods of crises, force them onto the working classes through mass privatizations. Like in the context of 2008, we saw this privatization of higher education that followed on its heels with increasing tuition and, the kind of shittier services that are offered by UC. The community colleges in the state now charge higher and higher tuition than they did in the past, and they're literally closing their doors and eliminating courses for students instead of offering new ones. There's this big social struggle that Gerald was referring to in Oakland, where the city council is overrun, the school council is overrun by privatization advocates, charter school
Take
kind of
money
plans.
directly from them.
Yeah, and so that's now leading to this closure of all these schools, and there's an occupation happening. But there's across the bay in City College, San Francisco, there's a huge ongoing crisis there around privatization and big city interests trying to close things down. So I think that the Marxist perspective today would really kind of point to the fact that 2008 was a big opening. It's true that Occupy made a big difference in a way. It's true that a lot of different left currents contributed to Occupy, but it's also true that there was very weak organized opposition, and so the effect of that was very muted, right, guys? We've all been through this now again and again. We've been through this again and again. These movements develop and then implode, and they lack staying power. They lack organizational forms that can provide them backbone to even resolve internal disputes. For example, I mean, people who work together politically don't have to be friends. They don't have to like each other. In fact, famously, they used to be able to sell the newspaper together and not really talk too much, So we need more of that kind of thing, I think, if we're gonna actually get somewhere. Because I do agree that the crisis is coming. The economy's not going to be good.
You're right about
Commodity forms are more pernicious than they used to be, and that kind of thing. Like you guys are getting at with surveillance and social media. But without big organized opposition, in some sense, it's not really gonna.
That's true.
It's not really going to be effective.
Can I share something here?
Well, I'm just gonna ask you guys to give some opening or closing remarks, and you can hopefully fold in some
I will.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm going to ask all the speakers to just take 2 to 3 minutes if you want to offer some closing remarks, and then maybe fold in any remaining responses and answers to questions that other people might have had. So then we can do Mike, then David, then Keith, then Gerald, then August. Okay, please go.
So I won't take the full 3 minutes. I'll return to the early themes of my opening comments. Political work requires both theory and practice. Theory without practice, the university, that's the game here. You gotta have some idea of like what you're trying to accomplish, some sense of analysis, what's going on around you and where you want to go with it. But you also have to have an actual practice. You've got to go out and try things out and see what happens with your theory. And you know, the theory of Marx, is not the theory of 1848 for those of us that still consider ourselves Marxists. It needs to be transformed. And again, on the other side, simply doing practice, going out and sort of helping out and trying to respond with your heart, which is, again, it's not a bad thing to do. I'm not going to punish somebody or shame them for doing that, but it's not enough. It's not what's really needed. And so there really needs to be sort of a serious effort to try and combine theory with practice. It's very difficult to develop those things together. It's very difficult to do that, but you can't do that by yourself. It's not the Lone Ranger. You don't ride into Tucson and fix the place no matter how smart you are and how committed or whatever. You need to find comrades, friends, people you can work with, eventually move towards an actual structured organization that supports you in the work. And to me, that's really where we need to be doing a lot more of. And I unfortunately, I see that there's this kind of divide between theory and practice. And the end result is there's not much strategizing going on. There's a lot of feeling going on. There's a lot of protests. There's a lot of activism. Americans are not unactive. I mean, the right and the left, everywhere. People are acting. They're doing stuff. But it's not structured in a way that's going to move in a positive direction. So I don't know, everybody has to find that balance for themselves, but there needs to be a way to integrate the theory and practice in a way that is not happening on the left right now. That's my comment.
Thank you. David, please.
Well, I guess my only closing kind of thought is that today there's, in a way, you encounter a lot the idea that things are very bad. This can be summed up by looking at like the environment or growing surveillance and the strength of the intelligence services. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there about what's going on. But I think it's really important to emphasize that the capitalist system, despite facing various problems, is really gonna be here. It's gonna keep working. People are gonna be finding employment. They're gonna be needing to take care of families. There's gonna be lots of bread and butter issues that are politically consequential. So there's been a tendency on the left, at least on sectors of the far left that I've been around, to think that the end of capitalism is in a way well nigh, or it's already here. But I think that that's contradicted by the experience of the last 12 years, where the end of capitalism, or at least a major crisis unfolded and things recovered actually, and the whole social relations of commodity production expanded in an unprecedented way in the form of smart devices and social media companies, right? So there's no reason why this system can't keep reinventing itself, even just on the basis of a more marginal and, digital and whatever kind of, room for maneuver, even in the face of the climate situation. So it's very important to have a politics that's able to address that rationally. Again, this is something like that can speak to working people, right? Because sometimes the catastrophism, they see through it. They see through the catastrophism of people's ideology of the system or whatever. Okay.
Okay, thanks. And then now Keith, would you like to give your?
Yeah, well, I think we're in such an interesting new time that, and I think the propaganda about left and right has been so, like, corrupted that it's more like what are the philosophies and the roots of leftism in reality that are what are important to emphasize. And I think a lot of people who would think of themselves as Republican actually totally are down with the ideas of the left, but they don't want to be around the left because it's communist, socialist, and they've been indoctrinated to hate these things. So I think that that's one of the lessons we learned in Food Not Bombs, was to not be an anarchist movement, but to be physically creating changes on the ground, and in as many ways as possible, and having the philosophy, the basic philosophies of decentralized, non-hierarchical way of organizing, and and that's why those three principles work. And so I think it is a really beautiful time at which we can actually get a lot more working class unity, where being united around actually really the fundamental principles of what's the left, without being so concerned about it being called left. And I think the right is starting to find that themselves, the people that were not far right, Nazis and stuff, but the people that were, like, kind of gravitating towards what the message of the Republican Party once was from their point of view, which no longer exists for them either. So there's this really beautiful chance in the collapsing of, and I don't think that it's a failure of capitalism that we're having an economic collapse. I think it's a strategy of capitalism that we had the housing crisis, that we're now having a total collapse of the entire economic system, because it benefits this oligarchy that's ruling the world, and so I think that. And also whatever's going on with the Ukrainian war that has resulted in this fracturing is really fascinating. And is opening up a lot of things, and I don't know if whether it's just this arrogance, like I said before, or if there's a capitalist strategy around trying to do this. It's really fascinating. But it is a really good time in one sense, but it's going to be very brutal. And the pain and suffering of people being forced into the streets and by the tens of thousands, and it's there's like a lot of issues surrounding that. Sanitation comes to mind.
That's right.
Because where's all these millions of unhoused Americans going to poop? It's going to get to be really hardcore.
Well, yeah. You're right. Okay, now Gerald, could you please give your closing remarks?
This is our closing 3-minute remark.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'm very happy that I was here. Actually, I believe it or not, old as I am, I learned a few things, and I paid attention to what people were saying. I think that Keith is absolutely correct when he says that capitalism is in a major crisis right now. He's the only person that raised that consistently, and he's right. Now, at the same time, I want to tell you that the labeling of the group, Food Not Bombs, as terrorists, or that shit is old. The Black Panthers were called #1 national security risk as early as 1968. I didn't learn about and understand this. I was 17 years old, 18 at the time. But after they assassinated over 35 of our leaders, locked up people, etc., I kind of got the message. And then later on, due to Ward Churchill's book, Agents of Repression, take note of that, I actually formally learned about their program of COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program. So let me tell you, Keith is old.
It is,
Been around. Now, today, though, I'd like to just take you through, just touch on the situation I'm organizing in now, SLAP, that is Schools and Labor Against Privatization. This is a local situation. It's really an Oakland phenomenon, okay? And I'm trying to do the best I can, but this is what you get. One, see, this is where I disagree with Mike. So he says, you gotta get to know the community, you gotta go and, deal with the community in a couple of years. Well, that's not bad, I'm not against that, but let's look at what the community actually knows and what happens. Initially, we called out to the surrounding community to join the occupation, and they accommodated us. They came in. Oh boy! But what did we get? We got something I call substitutionalism, and that is some people were working 3 days in a row without any sleep, without going home, sick. Absolute, there's no way you can allow that. I had to just put my fist on the table to let people know this was counterproductive. For obvious reasons, I hope I don't have to go on about that. Simple things like majority rule. We came up with an understanding, I'm sorry my time is over, but let me just finish this, that we must not talk to the police, and we must not talk to the administration from the Oakland Unified School District. Well, I got tapes of us talking to them, after we had this discussion. I'm sorry. That's where people are at. And it's bad. And yes, we put a stop to that. Now, I was attacked by a poet on it. This is not uniting the community. Get gone. If you can't get with that, with the discipline of not talking with the enemy, get gone. We're better off without you. And then this discipline is unfortunately something that is not in people. It has to be placed in people by people with higher consciousness. I'm finished.
All right, Augustine, would you give your closing remarks, please?
All right. I guess the thing that I would ram in that sort of ties into everything else and the questions that were being asked with regards to this is that I would just continue to focus on confrontation and polemics. The point that I was trying to draw together and forgot when I got caught up in making fun of Americans was that what you have to do when somebody is not necessarily in a place where their position in society, for whatever reason, does not instill in them a sense that their doom is imminent just by nature of who they are, the same way it does for somebody like me, is that you just have to continuously bombard them with the worst of what's going on, not through some middleman, like not through a news agency who are prone to misrepresent the events, not through any of that, but you have to just one-on-one continuously just ram that in until you find that the person who is being subject to this has found themselves just completely numb and utterly feeling as though their worldview has been shattered, because that's kind of what you're going for. You're going up against Americanism, which has been instilled in all of us for as long as we have been Americanized, and it is that Americanism that prevents us from being fully realized humans. It is that Americanism that prevents us from understanding key concepts, from developing fully realized critical understanding, from being able to issue effective structural critique. And so the only way that you are going to get that out of people who have not necessarily exited Americanism to any extent, not even starting to develop some nascent structural critique, is you basically have to shatter their world in a way. And lockdown did that well enough for a lot of people. Seeing
I'm sorry, repeat that last.
Lockdown.
Lockdown.
Was enough for that, like the pressure cooker of lockdown and of seeing the 3rd precinct burn down and the sweet catharsis that was at that time. I remember that night very well. It's like one of the only things I remember past a year ago at this point.
You mean, right?
Yes, in Minneapolis. Oh yeah. And just that continuous stream of events, the horrors that we've been subject to. Over 1 million people dead from COVID alone and nothing about it. It's like no mention of it, no mention of the unreported deaths or anything. We're just moving on. Being forced to repeatedly face that horror and understand that horror does change you. And I think that people get too focused on the idea that it's going to cause what is being called doomerism, like, that sort of defeatism and giving up, are off the mark, because I've far more often seen it produce resolve to extricate yourself from that system that you've been placed within, because you realize that it is pure poison for you and for your ability to exist, and then work to drag other people out of it. I mean, it's literally Plato cave shit going on here. I'm basically done, I suppose. I didn't have any preparation to say anything on this panel. I just came up with all of it on the car ride here. So.
Thanks for
That's all
joining
right,
us.
though.
And,
That's all
a huge
right.
thank you to all our panelists today for their remarks, which we really appreciated. This has been a panel put on by the UCSC chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Have a good evening, and be sure to talk to me and other members of the Platypus Club, so like Kevin and Miles. If you if you want to get involved in our activities, thank you again for coming out to support.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.